So I'm going to talk to you guys tonight about preparing puppies for sport, conditioning, and injury prevention. And I'm going to try and make this as broad as possible so that it can apply to, all the different sports and activities that you guys are doing with your dogs, but certainly happy to answer follow-up questions about, individual dogs or individual sports. So as an overview, breaking down talking about puppies, we'll talk about assessing suitability for sport, assessing readiness to start sport-specific training, and then some puppy preparation recommendations. Specifically to conditioning, we'll talk a little bit about the idea of CrossFit versus more sports-specific training, as well as training frequency. And then injury prevention, we'll talk about some warm-up and cool-down recommendations and some early signs of injury to look for while you're working with your dogs. So one of the things that we want to think about when we're assessing a puppy's suitability for sport really comes down to the individual activity or sport that we're considering if that dog has the correct build or conformation for that sport. Now, you guys are probably, obtaining your dogs with an intent to do a particular activity and maybe looking for a particular type of dog to be able to successful in that. And we know that our conformation dogs versus our field dogs or dogs that are going to excel in agility, they're going to be built differently. The other thing is their drive is also going to be very different. So your conformation dogs are going to be much more laid back. They're more your like family friendly type golden versus the dogs that are going to excel in our high drive sports or hunting are going to be a very, very different breed of golden, basically. In my realm, I also think a lot about what that build, that conformation means as far as potential for musculoskeletal conditions. So some of the most common orthopedic issues that we have in golden retrievers, they get at a very early age. So hip and elbow dysplasia, patella luxation, these are all things that we can identify in them quite young and predisposes them to developing arthritis and having issues in the future. So specifically to hip dysplasia, I wanted to talk about some ways that we might be able to assess, an individual puppy for their, potential of having this as an issue, or potentially if we're looking at two parents and deciding on a puppy for their potential sport, if they could be predisposed to this. So standard is to perform OFA hip radiographs or x-rays. The downside to this is that they really have to be 2 years old for certification for these results to be meaningful. And these x-rays provide us with qualitative results. So basically 7 categories from excellent to severe. The way that the imaging is taken actually minimize their hip laxity. So it can make hips look better than they truly are. And ultimately it's a pass-fail for an individual dog. So if they already have arthritis, which hopefully our puppies don't, then it's a helpful test. But otherwise, for our young dogs under a year or 2 of age, it's not super helpful in determining, do they have hip dysplasia? Are they at risk for developing arthritis? Are they appropriate for a particular sport that we're interested in, or there's certain precautions that we need to take when they're participating in a particular sport? So the recommendation that we have is if we're at all concerned about a puppy having hip dysplasia, or as a general screening recommendation for these young dogs, is to do pen hip radiographs or x-rays. And the advantage of these types of x-rays is that they can be done at 16 weeks of age, so 4 months versus 24 months. And it gives us quantitative results. So a numerical distraction index from 0 to 1. And the images here that I have on the left, this is showing a nice normal hip distraction, that there's always going to be a little bit of laxity or space between the ball and socket portion of that joint. But compared to the image on the right here, where there's a lot more laxity or distraction happening. So this is the dog that has hip dysplasia. And again, we can identify that as young as 16 weeks of age and potentially do something about it so that they can have a much more normal, healthy life. So this is an example of what that pen hip readout looks like. And the nice thing about this too is that it compares to a breed average. So the breed average for golden retrievers is 0.52 is the distraction index number. And based on hundreds of thousands of dogs that have had this type of radiographic study done at this point, they've determined that a number less than 0.3 puts a dog at very, very low risk of developing hip arthritis in their future. So as a breed, unfortunately, Goldens, again, are predisposed to having hip dysplasia. So it is something that we really need to keep in mind with these guys and do everything we can to try and reduce those numbers over time as a breeding population, as well as for the individual, try to minimize the impact that it has for that dog if they are one of the ones that have more lax. The other big question with our puppies is when do we start repetitive motion training? So a lot of our sports involve jumping, running, some things that can be higher impact. So, our puppies, they bounce back after little things like this, but we have to keep in mind that for our very young puppies in particular, their bones and joints are not fully formed. So this is an X-ray example of a puppy that's about 3 to 4 weeks of age. And there's just so much space between all of these bones that is all just soft and very prone to injury. So unfortunately, we don't have, concrete numbers of age that it is now safe for them to do running and jumping and these higher impact activities. But we do know that the longer we wait to do these things, once they're more skeletally mature, that it's going to be safer for their bodies to do those activities. So making decisions for the individual puppy, we really want to focus on helping to develop their balance and their proprioceptive system, or their awareness of where their limbs are in space. And this helps them to move in a safer manner over different terrains, over obstacles, as well as catch themselves if they do slip up to hopefully prevent injury. So I have some examples and images here of ways that we can help to promote balance and proprioceptive training in our young dogs. So having different obstacles for them to be walking over, different textured surfaces for them, gravel, mulch. And then, I have in my disposal different rehab equipment. So things like wobble boards, these paw pods to work on getting them on different balance type equipment as well. So preparing puppies for sport, one of the really easy things that I like to do is teach limb awareness through forelimb and hind limb targeting. And unfortunately, I couldn't find a good video of hind limb targeting. And so included just a picture of forelimb targeting with one of my puppies that if we can teach them where their legs are in space, just very simply by asking them to put their front paws up onto a target and then putting their back paws up into a target, that's really helping their young neurosystem to learn where their feet are in space and how to move their bodies safely. We can also introduce basic core exercises that we can build upon in our later stages of sport as part of conditioning. And one of the easiest ways to do this is through practicing stacking. So having the front legs and the back legs portion below the hop nice and vertical, asking them to keep their back and their pelvis nice and flat, and then having a nice little tuck to their abdomen. We can also work on core through asking them to sit with a nice proper posture. So the image on the left here is a kind of lazy, sloppy sit where the back is curved and the legs aren't as nice and straight and positioned where I want them. Versus on the right here, this is a nice square tucked sit where the back is nice and straight. The front legs are vertical to the floor. The back legs are tucked squarely under the torso. And then the knees fall in front of the back toes, compared to this image where the knees are behind the toes. We can think about the same thing with the down posture. So image on the top here, this dog has a very curved spine. He's leaning towards his back end and kind of tucking his butt, versus the image on the bottom here is what we're looking for, with the elbows tucked underneath the body, the back quite a bit straighter, the back legs again squarely tucked under the torso with the knees pushed forward in front of the back. So even though this is an older dog in the pictures, this is something very safe, very easy to start introducing with our young puppies. When we're first teaching them how to sit and lay down on command, working on that proper posture helps to build that core strength and that back strength right into the command itself. Makes it a very natural position for them to assume. So moving on to our adult dogs now, how do we go about conditioning them? So they're living, a normal kind of pet dog life, and we want to introduce them to sport and help them to excel at it. And one way that we can do that is through CrossFit conditioning, which CrossFit incorporates the 4 different pillars of fitness, which are balance, strength, flexibility, and endurance. And if we work on each of these tiers, it creates a really well-rounded individual. But we don't have to spend as much focus on each category depending on what we want them to do. For example, we don't need to take an agility dog and run them for 30 to 40 miles a day like we would with a sled dog, because they just don't need that type of endurance. We don't need their muscles to activate and work in that same way. And we could potentially create a dog that now can't sprint as fast as possible for success in agility. So that's where sports-specific conditioning really comes in. And for this, we want to really break down the specific common movements of the given sport. And we can use this to create a stepwise conditioning plan for them. So as examples, I've taken 2 particular movements that occur commonly and are actually similar between agility and dock diving. So looking at the takeoff during agility and dock diving, where the dog is still in contact with the ground, but using an explosive or propulsive force of the hind limbs to jump off. And then the next step, which would be the airborne stretch out, where they're really extending their back and their hind legs. So that first step of creating a conditioning plan for this example, for the first example of the push-off, would be to find a stationary exercise that requires similar muscle activation as the movement. So I've taken the image of the dog jumping over the agility hurdle and turned it sideways, and that looks a lot like this dog that's doing what I call a front paws up, where they are static. They're just standing with their weight shifted onto their back legs and their front legs elevated. So this very safe, gentle exercise is helping to strengthen their lower back, their core, their hind limbs in a manner that's very similar to the type of activation that they would need during the movement of jumping. So it's a great, safe way to start that first step of conditioning. And then for our dog that's now airborne, we want to really think about how can we activate the core and the back muscles. And we can do that through an exercise called planking, where again, the dog is stationary. We're asking them to stand with their forelimbs vertical. So we're asking them to really put a lot of the weight through their core, through their back, by standing on a platform that is held very far behind them. So again, these are very similar, but we've broken that movement of jumping down to a stationary exercise that we can work on. The next step would then be to perform controlled repetitions of the exercise that mimics a portion of the movement. So going back to our push off for jumping or for dock diving, we can do something like an elevated sit to stand. And you'll probably want to come in here and watch elevated it. And the hind limbs on the ground, and asking the dog to basically do squats. So again, we're using those very muscles that they use to propulse themselves to push off, that we can build strength through controlled repetitions that they can then use. And then finally, I do realize this is not a dog, it is just the best image I have of what I wanted to talk about.
Yeah, you're making too much
Practicing the movement at a normal speed in repetition. So for our jumping, we want to practice that repetition of jumping in a normal situation for them. But really, again, just breaking down that jumping. So talking about agility, we don't want to condition them through the entire agility course. It's really just the repetition of jumping to improve the conditioning towards the jumping activity. So frequency of training sessions, when we're talking about strengthening activities, so particularly sprinting, jumping, targeted muscle strengthening, because it is quite taxing to the body, we want to only do that about 2 to 3 days a week and have at least 1 day of rest in between sessions. In between those strengthening sessions, it is okay to do balance, flexibility work, go for walks, do normal kind of pet dog play. But we don't necessarily want to do really targeted focused exercise every single day because they need that time to rest and recover in between to build strength in the end. That being said, I know a lot of times your competitions may be several days in a row. So if that's the case, then we need to build up the dog to incorporate a similar schedule into their training routine leading up to competition. And then just before the competition, potentially slightly de-escalate that training so that they have time to recover fully and be ready for competition. So as an example, let's say we have a 3-day weekend competition that is 6 weeks away. During weeks 1 and 2, maybe we do a training session Monday, Wednesday, Friday. And then week 3, Monday, Tuesday, Friday. So we're starting to bring them a little closer together, giving less time to recover. Week 4, bring it even closer together, Monday, Tuesday, Thursday. And then week 5, you do your 3 days in a row, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. The week before the competition, though, we want to de-escalate that training frequency. So that week we do Monday, Wednesday. They have a few days to recover before their weekend competition starts. Yeah, just an example. But looking ahead to competitions or weekends that you know you're going to be active with your dogs, you can kind of block out time like that to help prepare them and still give them that little bit of time to rest beforehand so they're out. So injury prevention is really important and also challenging. Our dogs that are participating in sport often love what they do and are very driven and don't always make great decisions, but we certainly do everything we can to prepare them. And that, starts with the conditioning and training that we do, but it also comes down to what we do immediately before they compete or are active. And a warm up is really critical to prepare the soft tissues, so our muscles, our tendons, our ligaments, as well as the cardiovascular system for the impending work. During the warm up, it's important to try and keep the dog's arousal level low so that we're not overexerting the dog prior to their actual activity. We don't want them to be tired or to used up their energy stores before they actually go into the ring to compete. That would not be helpful. And anytime that there's a rest of more than about 10 to 15 minutes, we want to repeat that warm-up session. So if you have a couple of different classes that you're competing in a given day, we want to make sure we're doing that warm-up each time if there's time in between. So what is a warm-up? At minimum, it should include some amount of walking and trotting. And this doesn't have to be very long, but even 2 to 3 minutes will help to prepare that body.
There you go.
It's also helpful to do some lateral bends, so doing active figure of 8 stretches to help warm up those muscles of the back and limbs, and then activate some core and key limb muscles. So for example, we could do some sit to stands and down to stands. We could work on some sidestepping, or in this video, I have pivoting to warm up those muscles on the inner and outsides of the limbs. And then backwards walking to work on muscles like your your glutes and your hamstrings. So all in all, a warm-up can take, 5 to 8 minutes to just keep those muscles, get those muscles ready for what we're about to ask them to do. And then the final step of a warm-up is to do something that's specific to the sport they're going to be performing. So doing some short retrieves, doing some hurdles, use what you have available to you. You may not have, an agility hurdle that you can have them jump over during a warm-up, but maybe you could teach them to jump over your leg or have a pool noodle, just to, again, get those muscles prepared for what we're about to ask. After exercise, we want to do a cool down to help those soft tissues and cardiovascular system to return to a resting state faster. We also, again, want to return the dog's arousal to a low level. While we're doing our cool down, it's a great opportunity to assess for signs of injury, looking for any lameness, abnormal weight shifting, or hesitance to perform a particular movement. So during our cool down, we again want to do that short walk and trot, watching them for any off movements or lameness. We can do some static lateral bend exercises. So this is an example of a cookie stretch where we're asking the dog to bring their nose towards their shoulder and their hip. Stretch out those hip flexors and the back, having them put their front paws up on a surface and holding it. And then we could do a hamstring stretch or a play bow to stretch out the muscles of their back. So the warm-up is all about movement and getting the body, moving in the types of manner that we expect the activity to involve, versus our cool down is slowing everything down, doing gentle stretching. But ultimately, if we can get the dog to do an active stretch rather than us pulling on legs or forcing them into a particular position, that's what we're aiming for. So last, we're going to talk about some early signs of injury. And these can be really subtle. So things like altered stance or posture. In this image on the left here, this dog, to me, is leaning towards that right front leg, off of the left front leg. This wrist joint is more in a bent position and turned out to the side a bit. So I wonder, is there something going on with that left front leg that the dog doesn't want to put full weight on it? In the image on the right, this dog is not nice and flat through its spine. So we have a very high rear and a lower front with some curvature of the spine here, as well as the dog is not standing squarely. So those front legs should be nice and even. So again, I question, maybe there's some mild injury going on with this dog. So you guys know what's normal for your dogs. And I very frequently find that you guys are finding really subtle things in your dogs, which is really awesome. We can also think about how they're doing in a sit or down position if their posture has changed. So very common if we have knee injuries, the dogs will no longer want to sit square. They'll sit with one leg popped out to the side. And then dogs that are having hip pain will often sit with a very either narrow stance or very wide-based stance. So it can go either way. But really just looking for changes in your dog is the most important thing when we're looking at our stance and our posture. Know your dog's normal and know when things aren't right. Looking at lameness or off movements, slow motion videos can be really helpful. These are my two dogs, which both of them are abnormal. And when my golden is running fast, a lot of lay people wouldn't notice anything's wrong with him. But as soon as I slow this down, people are like, oh yeah, that those legs aren't normal. So picking up on things like that, or potentially more subtle things. Reduced performance is one of the other really important things to be looking out for as early signs of injury. Don't take it as your dog is being stubborn or, forgot to do something or is having a bad day. Look at those things as, is my dog hurting? And these include things like hesitation to jump on or off, take tight turns or crouch or crawl, depending on which activity is normal for them, which is what they're doing. For agility dogs, looking at things like more increasing frequency of knocking bars or popping out of the weaves. For dogs doing barn hunt or hunting, reduced scenting abilities. So they seem to like run right past the scent that normally they would find very easily. That could be because of pain, that their brain is dealing with all of the pain signals instead of allowing the sense to be interpreted and identified as clearly as it normally would be. And then slowing run times, especially for activities like backpack and agility. So some general advice that I wanted to give to you guys is to consider routine assessments with a sports medicine professional, both before starting sport-specific training with a new puppy, potentially talking about doing some screening evaluations of hips and elbows at the beginning of the season or a little bit before the season so that we can make sure that your dogs are at their peak before their season starts. And of course, anytime that you have concerns. We can also consider routine musculoskeletal wellness care. So things like massage, acupuncture, medical manipulation, or chiropractic. And the goal of these things are to maximize performance and can also help to identify early signs of the problem. So these are certainly things that if you want to know more about them and in a future talk, we'd be happy to share about those as well. But I think can be really helpful for our athletic dogs to help maintain them in their. So in summary, for an individual dog, we want to make sure that we're assessing them for suitability in their given sport and making sure that we're adequately preparing them for their sport-specific activities. We can incorporate warm-ups and cool-downs to help prepare them for their activity and assess for early signs of injury after. The earlier we identify those issues, typically it is easier to treat when we identify it earlier rather than once it's gone on for a very long time. With that, I'd be happy to take any questions. And these are my guys right now. So I do have a disaster of a golden. He has lots of orthopedic problems, but I love him. And then I also raise service dogs. So I have one puppy or two puppies in the house at all times as well.
Just had to go unmute myself. Any questions? I muted the few of you that didn't mute yourselves. I muted you just so we wouldn't have any background noise. So if you have a question, go on and unmute yourself and raise your hand or ask. I know those sports are things that a lot of our club members do, so very, very fitting for us as a group.
I'm sure there may be individual questions. You know, we're always happy. I have my email address here. We're happy to talk about, you know, more individualized things as well. But hopefully this gave a more broad overview that is helpful for everybody.
Yeah, ufl.edu. And I'll put your contact in when I type up the minutes and everything so that everyone, even if they weren't able to join the call, they can still see it and contact you guys if they have any questions or need anything further. Did anyone have any questions or anything before we move on with our meeting? No? All right, I guess you answered everything.
Hopefully.
I just want to say it was excellent. Thank you.
Of course. Thank you for inviting me to join.
Yeah, thank you so much. We love it when we can have a speaker to educate us and share knowledge. Oh, Danette said, does lack of fitness lead to higher risk of injury?
Yes, absolutely. So we know that if we're asking dogs to do activity and they are not fit, they are at greater risk of injury. We are asking them to use, you know, muscles and balance systems that are not well developed. There may be dogs that are lucky and don't get injured that are not prepared for those activities, but if we're asking them to do high level of activity, we really do want them to be as fit as possible to maximize the safety for them.